All right, today we're jumping into a really fascinating intellectual clash. This is one that gets right to the heart of how we argue for our deepest beliefs. We're going to explore two major schools of thought and their clash over reason and faith.
So let me just start with a question for you. Think about it. When you're trying to convince someone of something that you believe is fundamentally true, where do you even begin? Do you look for some kind of common ground, some neutral, objective territory? Or is that whole idea of neutrality just a myth? Okay, here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at the fundamental disagreement itself. Then, we'll introduce our two competing teams, Team Princeton and Team Amsterdam. After that, we'll see what the author of our source material has to say, and finally, we'll unpack why this classic debate matters way beyond the world of theology. All right, so let's set the stage. Our story takes place on the intellectual battleground of what's called Christian apologetics, which is basically the field dedicated to defending the faith. Now, when you hear apologetics, don't think apologizing. It's not about saying you're sorry. It's the practice of making a rational case, of using reason and evidence to argue for the Christian faith. But how you're supposed to do that? Well, that's the source of this massive historical debate. So right at the center of all this, you've got these two legendary schools of thought. They're nicknamed for where their key thinkers were based: Old Princeton over in the United States and Amsterdam in the Netherlands. And their answers to our big starting question, they could not be more different. And wow, this table really lays it all out, doesn't it? On one side, you have Princeton, believing you start from a neutral place of shared reason. But on the other, you have Amsterdam saying, nope, no such place exists. Princeton thinks an unbeliever can judge evidence objectively, while Amsterdam argues that, well, their mind is actually fundamentally hostile to the truth. Let's break down each of these sides. First up, let's talk about Team Princeton. We're talking about thinkers like B.D. Warfield. Their entire project, their whole approach, is about finding that common ground. And this quote from Warfield, this is so important to understanding them. He's saying, you don't start by asking someone to believe the Bible is divinely inspired. That's a huge ask. For him, that's the conclusion you work towards, the absolute last piece of the puzzle, not the first premise you lay down. So their method is everything. It's super systematic, a step-by-step, evidence-first kind of approach. First, they say you treat the Bible just like any other historical document to show it's authentic and credible. Then, you argue it's a trustworthy report. And only then, based on all that evidence, do you make the case for its divine inspiration and ultimately for Christianity itself. The whole philosophy here, the bedrock of their argument, is this idea of a neutral playing field. It assumes that every single person, no matter what they believe, has access to this universal right reason, the ability to weigh evidence objectively and follow a logical argument wherever it leads. And what's the end game for this method? Well, it's not about getting to absolute 100% certainty right out of the gate. The goal is to build a case so strong that Christianity becomes the most probable explanation for all the evidence. It's a case built on likelihood. Okay, now let's flip the coin and get into the other side of the ring, Team Amsterdam, led by figures like Abraham Cooper. Their starting point is the complete opposite. They say there is no neutral ground, because every argument you could ever make begins with a foundational belief, a presupposition. This quote from Cooper, man, it just perfectly captures their whole vibe. He sees two fundamentally opposed ways of thinking in the world. He calls them the natural principle of the unbeliever and the special principle of the Christian. And for him, these two aren't just different, they are in a head-on collision, where one is actively trying to destroy the other. And this illustrates those two warring frameworks perfectly. The natural principle starts from human autonomy, from our own reason, and it tends to see anything supernatural as just irrational. But the special principle, it starts from God's revelation and says our reason has to submit to it. For Kuyper, you can't build a bridge between these two worlds. They operate from completely different foundations. And here we get to the absolute core of their argument. You can't prove your starting assumption, what philosophers call a first principle. It's the lens you use to see all the other proof. I mean, you can't use logic to prove that logic itself is valid, right? You have to start somewhere. And for Cooper, you either start with God's revelation or you start with human autonomy. There's no third option. So, just to sum up Amsterdam's position, reason isn't some neutral tool. It's always biased by our core commitments. An unbeliever, because they're working from a hostile framework, can't possibly be an impartial judge. And the goal isn't to prove the Bible piece by piece, but to present it as the one true starting point and challenge the other person's entire worldview from the very beginning. Okay, so we've got these two powerful, totally opposing views. Where does that leave us? Let's turn to our source's author, the really influential theologian Cornelius Van Til, who's going to try and sort this all out. So Van Til, he actually lands firmly on Team Amsterdam's side. He agrees 100%. There is no neutral ground. But, and this is a big but, he argues that even Kuyper wasn't consistent enough. He points out that sometimes Kuyper and his buddies would slip back into Princeton-style arguments, appealing to that neutral reason they had just claimed was impossible. For Van Til, the only truly consistent method is something called presuppositionalism. And the idea is this: you don't argue to the truth of Christianity. You have to argue from it. You have to presuppose it as the necessary foundation that makes reason, logic, and even proof itself possible in the first place.
And this quote, this is basically his mic drop moment. Van Til's knockout punch is that the ultimate proof for Christianity is that without it, you can't actually prove anything at all. In his view, it's the only worldview that provides a coherent foundation for knowledge itself. Any other worldview, he argues, will eventually just collapse into irrationality.
Now look, I know this might feel like a really deep, maybe even niche theological debate, but the implications, they are massive, and they stretch way, way beyond religion. So, what should you take away from all this? This whole clash is really about epistemology, which is just the fancy study of how we know what we know. It forces us to see that all of our arguments are shaped by these deep, foundational beliefs. The Princeton method is basically the model for any argument that relies on shared, neutral facts. And the Amsterdam method is the model for any argument that claims your starting worldview totally changes how you interpret those facts. And that's really the bottom line. Whether you're debating politics or science or philosophy, you are never arguing in a vacuum. Every single argument rests on a set of unprovable foundational beliefs, on presuppositions. This debate just makes that reality incredibly clear. Which, brings it all right back to you and me. We all build our understanding of the world on foundations we often just take for granted. So the question this whole debate leaves us with is this: every argument has to start somewhere. What are your presuppositions?